what exactly was the U.S. mission?
Create stability in a badly divided country partially occupied by both Syria and Israel, while diplomats negotiated a withdrawal of all foreign forces.
That seems like a lot to expect.
No kidding. With the West interfering on a scale too small to make a difference, the Marines, housed in fixed positions at Beirut International Airport, became targets. So too did American diplomats. On April 18, 1983, a suicide bomber attacked the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63, including 17 Americans. The Marines began routinely taking fire from Lebanese militias. U.S. Navy warships positioned offshore returned fire. American firepower was vaguely intended to help the Lebanese army regain control of the situation, but it had little discernible effect. Viewing the Americans as unwelcome intruders, Israeli forces likewise subjected the Marines to systematic harassment. With no peace to keep, Western peacekeepers were becoming de facto combatants. As a consequence, the mission itself lost definition. Naively, Reagan himself thought that a show of muscle flexing would put things right. Here he is, writing in his diary on September 7, 1983. "I can't get the idea out of my head," he wrote, "that some F-14s coming in at about 200 feet and blowing hell out of a couple of artillery emplacements would be a tonic for the Marines and at the same time would deliver a message to those gun-happy Middle East terrorists." In his very instructive memoir, George Shultz, serving at the time as Reagan's Secretary of State, devotes 2 full chapters to laying out the details of this episode. Shultz's account makes clear the immense difficulty of the situation. Certainly, mischief makers far outnumbered those interested in the well-being of the Lebanese people, and we may sympathize with those confronting such complexities. What Shultz fails to do, however, is to make a persuasive case for the Marines being in Beirut in the first place. "We needed to stand firm," he wrote in his memoir, showing strength that was purposeful and steady. How having a few hundred Marines holed up at Beirut International Airport communicated a sense of purposefulness was not at all clear. More to the point, the crisis in Lebanon had induced a sort of strategic myopia in Washington. Because in truth, the disorder in Lebanon was not the problem. It was merely one symptom of a much larger problem. One too large for the entire U.S. Marine Corps, much less a reinforced Marine battalion to handle. In a New York Times dispatch published on October 23rd, Thomas Friedman, reporting from Beirut, wrote that, quote, "Without anyone really noticing at first, the Marines have been transformed during the last month of fighting into just one more faction in the internal Lebanese conflict." Much as it would 20 years later on an even larger scale in occupied Iraq, the United States was making itself party to a vicious civil war, fueled by larger regional antagonisms. The period of anyone not noticing ended abruptly. The very day that Friedman's article appeared in the Times, a suicide bomber, driving a truck loaded with 6 tons of TNT, crashed through the main gate of the Marine compound and drove into the building where the Marines were billeted. The resulting detonation killed 241 U.S. military personnel and wounded another 100. A near simultaneous attack killed 58 French peacekeeping troops. Well, back in Washington, support for continuing the mission collapsed along with the Marine barracks. The absence of a plausible, realistic policy was now obvious to all. At a memorial service held for those killed, the president projected a stiff upper lip. "Let no terrorist question our will," he declared, "or no tyrant doubt our resolve." In fact, the Reagan administration was already looking for an exit. Further embarrassments followed. When U.S. Navy carriers in the Med launched retaliatory airstrikes, 2 American combat aircraft were shot down. 1 aviator was killed and another captured. In February 1984, the Marines picked up stakes and left Lebanon for good. In a largely irrelevant gesture, one of the Navy's newly refurbished World War II battleships provided covering fire.
What had the Marines accomplished?
Next to nothing. Poor, tormented Lebanon continued to suffer. The country remained a battleground. A very nasty civil war dragged on for 6 more years. Syrian and Israeli forces continued to occupy parts of the country. Although the PLO had departed, Hezbollah emerged in its place to become another state within a state.
What lessons did Washington take from this experience?
Few of any real value. The Department of Defense convened a commission headed by a retired 4-star admiral to investigate the Beirut disaster. The resulting report was remarkable for its superficiality. Focusing on operational shortcomings, it dodged questions of politics and strategy. So the commission concluded, for example, that the attack on the Marine barracks, quote, was tantamount to an act of war using the medium of terrorism. What exactly was the nature of this war? What were the stakes? Who were the belligerents? On these questions, the report was silent. The Commission's report went on to say that, quote, much needs to be done on an urgent basis to prepare U.S. military forces to defend against and counter terrorist warfare. But the Commission did not ask whether it made sense for U.S. forces to be mucking around in this quarter of the world in the first place. What becomes clear in retrospect is this: Beirut ought to have set off alarm bells in Washington. What it might have taught is this: dabbling with using U.S. forces to fix the greater Middle East was an enterprise fraught with risk. Those who sent the Marines into Lebanon had no real idea what they were doing or what they were getting into. For the most part, the failure of the U.S. mission there served to broadcast American ignorance, ineptitude, and lack of staying power.